Welcome back to Rugby From The Stands, and to my beloved Bokke fans. It's been a while, hasn't it? I've missed you. And finally, Test Rugby is back, and it was so good to see the Springboks back in action. Yesterday, I did a deep dive stat analysis on my All Blacks team that played against the French. And before we go any further, I actually want to walk something back from that video. I kept calling the French side a B side, and I regret using that word because when you actually look at the team, they're probably very, very close to their strongest side. Maybe the front row was a little inexperienced, but the key spine of that team absolutely looks like a starting lineup, especially when you think ahead to a 2027 World Cup. So we shouldn't be calling them a second string team. That was a very, very strong French side that pushed the All Blacks all the way. And one of the big things we saw in that game was the pace. Both teams wanted to play at pace, and the numbers backed it up. 94% of the All Blacks rucks were under 3 seconds in the first half, 83% across the whole game. And credit to the French, they didn't try to slow it down. They were at 78% themselves. Both teams had real attacking intent. But today, we're not talking about the All Blacks. We're doing the same deep dive for the Springboks against England. And the first thing you'll notice, just from the eye test, is that this was a completely different game. Much slower, much more physical. The collisions were heavier, and the Springboks, to my eye, just dominated the whole thing. So what I want to do today is see what the stats actually say. And because we ran the exact same charts yesterday, we get a beautiful like-for-like comparison between the two games. Two games, same weekend, same competition. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll see they were basically two different games. And that's the beauty of rugby. There's multiple different ways to approach a game. There's multiple different styles, strategies. That's what makes rugby so entertaining. So without further ado, let's go straight into the numbers. First up, the top level numbers. South Africa, 45. England, 21. At Ellis Park, with James Dolman in the middle. And honestly, South Africa were unfortunate not to finish with a half century there. That last disallowed try, because of that forward pass, would have brought up 50. But still, a pretty dominant performance from South Africa. 7 tries to England's 3. 5 conversions for South Africa to England's 3. No penalty goals, which, by the way, tells you something in itself. Every single point in this game came from tries and conversions. Nobody was settling for threes. And here's one thing I noticed, because it tells you this wasn't one superstar having a fabulous night. Those 7 South African tries were scored by 7 different players. Thomas du Toit, a tight head prop inside 2 minutes. Then Colby, Arendse, Grant Williams, Creel, Marks, Dixon. 7 tries, 7 names. That's not a player carrying a team. That is a system producing points wherever it looks. And kudos to the South African coaching lineup that it's producing an entire system. Now, the overarching summary of how the game actually progressed. Let's look at the momentum worm. And if you're new here, it's dead simple. Along the bottom is the match minute. Up the side is the points margin. South Africa above the line and England below it. And look at that start. Within the first 10 to 12 minutes, South Africa scored 3 tries. Thomas du Toit in the 2nd minute, Colby in the 5th, Kurtley Arendse in the 11th. 17 points in 11 minutes. And here's what that means in efficiency terms. Their first 3 visits into the England 22 produced 17 points. They basically scored every single time they knocked on the door. Then the Arendse yellow card in the 27th minute, and that changed the momentum of the game. Before that card, England had nothing. No field position, no territory, no way in. After it, they finally had some ascendancy. They played in the better parts of the field, and they converted it. Genge over in the 35th, and George Martin just before the break in the 41st. So suddenly, it's 17-12, and England have a foothold. And here's the number that shows you how much that 10 minutes mattered. 12 of England's 21 points came in the window during and immediately after that sin bin. Basically, half their scoreboard came from 1 card. But then, and this is what the Springboks do to you, straight after the halftime, they wrestled the momentum right back. Grant Williams in the 44th minute, bringing the score 22-14. Jesse Creel in the 56th. And with the conversions, it's 31-14. Coles gets one back for England, bringing the score to 31-19. And for a moment, you're thinking, okay, this could get interesting. And then England gave away 2 yellow cards in 3 minutes. Freeman in the 69th minute, Pepper in the 71st. And I'm not saying England were coming back and winning. Of course, South Africa looked like they were dominating the whole game, and it never looked like they were ever going to lose. But whatever tiny chance existed died right there. Malcolm Marx off the back of a beautifully executed line-out maul in the 72nd minute. And interestingly, that was South Africa's first line-out maul try of the whole game, which is a little bit anomalous for them. And we'll come back to what that says about how they played. And then Dixon runs in the last one in the 78th. Colby converts both, 45-21. Game over. So the full picture, there was not one single moment in this game where England were ahead. South Africa led for nearly the full 80 minutes. England were chasing from the second minute to the final whistle. Now, let's move to the attack shape. How did the two teams actually try to attack? And I want to take a second to explain why this chart is built the way it is, because this is the thinking behind everything today. A lot of people say, oh, this team scored so many tries, that team scored this many tries. But hang on, to score tries, what do you need to do first? Obviously, you need to get into the other team's 22, the red zone. Okay, so to score more, you need more 22 entries. But entering the 22 is itself an outcome, right? Scoring tries is basically a lagging indicator. So what's the leading indicator? What do you need to do to even get into those 22s? And the answer is you need to win collisions, because rugby is a collision sport, right? That's post-contact meters. And you need to break the defensive line in your phase play. That's what this chart measures. On the x-axis is post-contact meters per ruck. And you might ask, why per ruck? Because a ruck is basically the end of a phase. You start a phase, and it usually ends in a tackle or a ruck. So per ruck is really per phase. For every phase you play, how many meters are you gaining after contact? If you're not gaining post-contact meters in a phase, you haven't actually bent the line. You've just moved sideways. And on the y-axis are line breaks per 100 rucks. How often does your phase play actually slice through the defensive wall? The raw per ruck numbers are tiny, so I multiply by 100 just to make them readable. High line breaks means you're playing with precision and finding space. High post-contact meters means you're more of a battering ram. And both together is the top right, a complete attack. The gray dots that you notice in the background, you'll see these on every team chart today, are every single test match team performance over the last 3 years, 430 odd games worth. That's your benchmark. That's how you know if a number is actually good or just sounds good. And before the rates, here's the raw number that genuinely blew my mind when I spotted it. Both teams had exactly 117 carries in this game. Identical number of carries. They carried the same number of times in this game. So every difference you're about to see is pure quality, not volume. Same amount of ball carried by both teams, and South Africa did it off fewer rucks. 98 to England's 107, and fewer passes, 127 to 140. England literally did more rugby actions, that is more rucks, more passes, and they produced less damage. Now the rates. South Africa, 3.3 meters per ruck. England, 2.6. And the line breaks, South Africa, 10.2 per 100 rucks. England, 4.7. The average of test rugby is about 6.7. So read that again. South Africa were above average on both axes, more than double England's line break rate. And England were below average on both. South Africa had a complete attack in this game. England on this chart were blunt and blocked. And that right there is the entire story of why one team had 10 visits to the 22 and the other only had 5. The tries were decided out here in the phase play, long before anyone reached the red zone. Okay, so South Africa played the more attacking rugby. They won the collisions, they made the line breaks. The next question is, what did you do with all that? Did the forward momentum actually become visits to the opposition 22? And when you got there, did you come away with points? Because that's what actually wins you test matches. Along the bottom is visits to the opposition, 22. Up the side, points per visit. Grey dots again, 3 years of test rugby, and the benchmark there is just under 3 points per visit, about 2.5. South Africa had 10 visits, 4.5 points per visit. And I ran that against the full 3-year data set. 4.5 points per visit is better than 91% of every test performance we have on record. Essentially, every time South Africa entered that 22, they scored a try. That is some next level efficiency. But here's the thing that genuinely surprised me. Because the eye test told me South Africa dominated everything. But England scored 4.2 points per visit. That's better than 87% of all test performances. That is world-class red zone execution. For like, yesterday we praised New Zealand as efficient at 3.7 and France at 3.2. England's 4.2 tops both of them. This slow, one-sided looking game was actually the 6th most ruthless game in our entire 3-year data set when you combine both teams. So England's problem was never what they did in the 22. Their problem was access. Only 5 visits all game, and only 16% of test teams in 3 years have managed 5 or fewer visits. So South Africa starved them of entries. England were lethal snipers, few chances and all taken. South Africa were the complete package. Twice the chances and a try nearly every time. England were good enough to take their chances. They just weren't good enough to create them. Now the kicking chart. Along the bottom, kicks per 100 rucks. So relative to how much ball you had, how often did you choose to kick it away? Up the side, territory percentage. Did the kicking or the not kicking actually buy you ground? Now I'll be upfront about the limits here because I always want to be honest about the data. I'm pulling from publicly available sources. I'm not paying for the special feeds. So I can't split out the types of kicks, the chips versus the grubbers versus the box kicks. If I had that, this chart would be even more interesting. But here's a reasonable assumption that we can make. If you're playing with territory in the opposition half, your kicks are more likely to be attacking kicks. The chips over the top, the grubbers in behind, the cross kicks. If you're pinned in your own half all game, your kicking is mostly pressure relief. You're not being adventurous back there, shall we say. So look at the numbers. South Africa kicked 30.6 times per 100 rucks, which against a 3-year benchmark is almost exactly what a standard test team does. England, 23.4. But the territory tells you who was kicking on their own terms. South Africa, 54%. England, 46%. South Africa kicked an average amount and bought above average ground with it. England kicked less, held the ball more, and was still pinned. And here's a little detail that shows you where all those South African kicks were landing. South Africa threw 18 lineouts in this game. 18. The test match median is 14. Fewer than 1 in 5 teams ever throw 18 or more. That's the signature of a team kicking for the corners and the touchlines all night, turning the boot into field position, into lineout launch pads, over and over. Remember the Mark Small try being their only maul try? 18 lineouts and they only needed the maul once. The other 17 were about geography. And the hidden key to that whole territory game has a name, Grant Williams. Have a look at this stat line because it's a mad one for a scrum half. 58 passes, most on the pitch. 16 kicks, which is more than half of South Africa's 30 for the entire game. So the territory plan was literally running through him. And then with all that game management work, 2 carries all night, on which he beat 4 defenders, made 38 meters, broke the line twice, and scored a try. He did the boring job all game and then punished England the only 2 times he ran. That is a proper Test Match 9 performance. Now, my favorite comparison of the whole weekend, collision dominance versus attacking tempo. Post-contact meters per carry along the bottom, and up the side, the percentage of your rucks recycled inside 3 seconds. How fast are you actually playing? Yesterday, New Zealand and France were up at 83 and 78% quick ball. Crazy tempo. the fastest stuff we've measured. Today, both teams at 47%, identical, and 47 is well below the test average of 56. In fact, taking both teams together, this was the 36th slowest game out of more than 200 that we've measured. So your eye test and my eye test was spot on. This was a slow, heavy arm wrestle playing at half the speed of the New Zealand versus France game. But here's the twist, and this is the insight of the weekend for me. You'd assume the slow, physical game is where all the dominant collisions happen, right? Wrong. Friday's fast game produced 23 dominant tackles between the two teams. This slow, physical game produced 5. What this game had instead was carry dominance. South Africa made 2.77 post-contact meters per carry, the highest of all 4 teams this weekend, and 324 post-contact meters in total, also the weekend high. So the physicality was real, but it lived on the ball-carrying side, not the tackling side. South Africa weren't smashing England backwards in the tackle. They were refusing to be stopped when they carried. Same brutality, completely different style. Now the breakdown. Same fast ball percentages along the bottom and up the side turnovers won. How much of their ball did you steal? Both teams at 47% quick ball, so below average for speed, as we said. On the steals, the test average is about 5 turnovers a game. South Africa won 4, so pretty close to par. England won 1 turnover in 80 minutes. And that gap is another quiet indicator of who owned the breakdown. South Africa was slowing England's ball and pinching it when it mattered. And England just couldn't live at that contact area. It's not a Jackal ROI stat line like we sometimes see. Nobody was diving on everything, but 4-1 at the breakdown in a game this physical is domination expressed politely. Now, defensive steal. And when I say steal, I don't mean stealing the ball. We just did that. I mean steal as in metal. How strong, how physically imposing is your defense? And on the x-axis, tackles made along the bottom, dominant tackles up the side. And this is the chart that genuinely shocked me. When I watched this game, I'd have bet good money that South Africa would have a pile of dominant tackles because that is who they are. And I went and checked the history on this. Across the last 3 years of Test rugby, South Africa averaged around 11 dominant tackles a game. Roughly 10% of everything that they hit is a dominant tackle. They're pinning you backwards. That's their identity. That's the Bokke brand. Tonight, one dominant tackle out of 174. That's 0.6%. And I dug further because I couldn't quite believe it. In 3 years and 436 team performances, only 6 teams have ever finished a test with 1 or fewer dominant tackles. And only 2 of those 6 won the game. Can you guess who both of them are? Yes, if you guessed South Africa, you guessed right. Last November against France in Paris, and last night, the only team in World Rugby that wins test matches while declining the dominant collision is the team most famous for the dominant collision. That is not accidental, and it's not fatigue. Twice in 9 months in their biggest away conditions tests, this exact profile has shown up. That's a style. That's a mode. Rassie has built a switch. And my conjecture, and I said this watching the game before I'd even seen any of the stats, is that this was about energy. This is the first game of the window at Ellis Park at altitude. They learned their lesson against the Wallabies up there last year when they emptied the tank, being dominant in contact and got gassed late. So this time, make the tackle, complete the tackle, don't spend the extra effort driving the man backwards, save that energy for the carry, where, remember, they were the most dominant team of the weekend. England, by contrast, spent that energy. 4 dominant tackles from 162. Atkinson, Martin, Earl. And interestingly, England made 12 fewer tackles than South Africa overall. Both teams end up in the soakers quadrant, but they got there for completely different reasons. Now the clean engine. Foundation versus self-sabotage. Along the bottom, total set-piece win percentage. And I want to explain that number because I've built it deliberately. It weights together your scrums, your lineouts, and your restarts received, all on your own ball. Why combine them? because each one alone can mislead you, and scrums especially. England, for example, can show a 100% scrum success rate, but if you watched the game, you saw South Africa win scrum penalties. How do both of those live together? Because rugby pass, sadly, only counts for a scrum as unsuccessful if you lose it on your own put in. Penalties you concede on the opposition's feed don't show up. I know it's partial. It doesn't give the full picture, but it's the data that I have access to. And combining scrums with lineouts and restarts at least gets us closer to the truth of how your platform looks like. Up the side is penalties conceded, and the axis is flipped. So higher means cleaner. So England actually had the better set piece percentage, 94.1 against South Africa's 89.6. And that's genuine credit to their lineout in particular, which went perfect on the night. But look at the other axis. South Africa conceded 6 penalties in an 80-minute test match. 6! That is a flawless foundation with clean hands. England conceded 13, plus the 2 yellow cards. And that puts them squarely in the quadrant I call great platform, but they keep blowing it. This is the last team chart, where the two teams actually played and who controlled the game. Now, quick clarification on the panel, so nobody misreads it. This is the share of your own possession spent in each zone. It's not where the game happened overall, it's where your ball lived. And it's a pretty similar shape for both teams. Actually, both spent the biggest chunk of their possession deep in their own 22. South Africa, 39%, England, 37%. And England actually had slightly more of their ball in the South African half than the reverse, which sounds strange for a 45-21 game until you remember what we saw on the execution chart. It's not where you hold the ball, it's what happens when you cross the 22. England carried their possession into decent areas and turned 5 entries into it. South Africa turned theirs into 10. But the right panel, game control, is where the domination lives. Minutes in the lead, 80-0. England were never ahead, not for even 1 second of this game. Possession in the last 10 minutes, 82% to South Africa. Points in the last 10, 14-0. 2 converted tries to close. That is as clinical a closing of a test match as you will ever see. Right. Now let's move on to the player charts. And we start with everybody's favorite, the carrier DNA. If you're a player, what kind of carrier are you? Defenders beaten per carry along the bottom, meters per carry up the side. And you might ask, why per carry here when the team charts were per ruck? Because as an individual player, you don't control how many rucks your team builds, but you completely control what happens when the ball is in your hands. Every carry, do you beat your man? And when they do get hands on you, do you keep going forward or do you go to ground? And clearly, look at Cheslin Colby. Phenomenal. Half a defender beaten every single carry. Every 2 times he touches the ball, someone missed him at nearly 7 meters a carry. Caden Murley, to be fair to England, was right up there too on meters. 7 per carry, just with less of the stepping than Colby. But the dot that scares me is Zachary Porton. Every single time that man got the ball, he beat at least 1 defender. 1.0 defenders beaten per carry. And here's the context from the weekend. Of every player across both games with at least 4 carries, only 2 men finished at a defender beaten per carry or better. Porton last night and Ruben Love on Saturday. And an honorable mention to Grant Williams, who only carried twice, so he doesn't make it onto this chart. But he beat 4 defenders on those 2 carries, which is just as crazy. 2 games, 2 different detonators, and Porton's a tight head prop, which makes it frankly quite scary. The shapes of the 2 teams are lovely on this chart too. South Africans cluster as gliders. We've got Williamson at 4.4 meters a carry on 13 carries, Creel at 4.4, Paul de Villiers at 5.3, Peter Steff gliding to 3.3 a carry on 12 carries without beating a single defender. Big men making meters without needing to step anyone. England's better carriers were the steppers. Finn Smith at 0.6 beaten per carry, Favour Boso at 0.57, Genge at 0.5. Now the enforcers. Tackles per 80 minutes along the bottom, normalized so that the bench players get a fair look. Though remember, if you come on for 20 minutes against tired legs, your rate will flatter you a little. Dominant tackle percentage is up the side, and you need 6+ tackles and 20+ minutes to qualify it to be on this chart. Because one dominant hit in one tackle would skew the data, right? The top of this chart is entirely English. Seb Atkinson at 11% dominance, George Martin at 9%, Ben Earl with a big shift and nearly 5%. England brought the physical edge in defense, and it deserves saying plainly. And then there's Tom Curry, 25 tackles per 80 minutes, the biggest defensive workload on the pitch. Insane numbers with 0 dominant hits. On the South African side, and a special mention for Ruan Nokia, 80 minutes, 17 tackles, 6 line-out takes, 1 penalty. That stat line is almost boring, and I mean that as the highest compliment. In a game plan built on staying connected, staying clean, and managing energy, that is gold. Then Thomas Dutoit, man, what a shift for a prop. 23 tackles per 80. Ben Jason Dixon, the same rate off the bench. Cameron Heinekom and Jasper Wiese both putting in big volume. And I was expecting dominant hits from those two specifically, and they held back, which by now you understand. It wasn't absence of aggression, it was a decision. South Africa tackled to complete, not to make a statement. Solid defense over dominant defense over 80 minutes at altitude. Now let's move on to Jackal ROI. Risk versus reward at the breakdown. Penalties conceded along the bottom, flipped, so cleaner is further right. Turnovers won up the side. You don't just want players who steal ball, you want players who steal it without handing the referee a reason to blow. And the cleanest thief of them all, Jasper Wiese. 2 turnovers won, 0 penalties conceded. Behind him is Ben Earl, and you got Cheslin Colby and Damien Dialande, all won a turnover each without conceding a penalty. So quality, quiet work. Then there's the long list of players who gave away 1 penalty and stole nothing. I'm not reading all 13 names. They know who they are. And at the wrong end, the ones I call pure liabilities. And look, it's a bit harsh as a label, but if I'm a coach and you've given away 2 penalties at test level with no turnovers to show for it, I'll be a bit mad. Caden Murley, 2. Paul de Villiers, 2. And Tommy Freeman, 2 penalties and the yellow card on top. Kurtley Arendse, yellow, sits in that middle group too. In a game where South Africa conceded 6 as a team, England's individual indiscipline is scattered all over this chart. Let's look at attack now. Who are our creators versus finishers? Try assists per 80 along the bottom, tries per 80 up the side. Everyone on here either scored or assisted. If you notice, nobody made the top right do-it-all corner this game. Nobody except arguably the closest thing we have, Malcolm Marx. A try and an assist from a hooker. And for the young rugby players watching, this is worth understanding. Coaches put just as much weight on creating tries as on scoring them. The newspapers count tries, the selectors count contributions. Marx, as a hooker, showing up as the most complete attacking contributor on this chart is a proper outlier and exactly why he is who he is. The 2 poles, you got Alex Mitchell, who is a pure creator, 1 try assist in a 26-minute cameo, which normalizes to over 3 per 80, comfortably the highest creation rate on the pitch. And Ben Jason Dixon, he's a pure finisher. A try at a rate above 2 per 80 minutes. He created nothing, but he finished everything. Special mention for Ollie Chesum, Damien Williamson, and Damien Dialande, who each made a try for someone else tonight. Now let's look at the playmaker map. 10s, 12s, and 15s. Defenders beaten per carry along the bottom. That's your running threat. Try assists per 80 up the side. That's your creation. And the size of the bubble is kick volume per 80. 3 jobs, 1 chart. And the honest headline, no true triple threat stood up in this game. Nobody who runs, creates, and kicks all at once. Damien Williamson is the closest. He beat defenders, he assisted a try, he kicked a bit. Dialande, pretty healthy on running threat with an assist. Marcus Smith beat defenders with those sidesteps of his. He kicked a little, created nothing for a teammate. Mani Lebok, same shape. Finn Smith, same. Seb Atkinson ran hard but created nothing. Compare that to last night where Jalibert was doing all 3 jobs at once. And it's another little marker of what kind of game this was. Now, you'll notice that Alex Mitchell is on this chart. And yes, the subtitle says nines are excluded. And yes, Mitchell is a nine. But he forced his way onto this chart. His creation numbers were so good, you simply couldn't ignore him. And he kicked more than any actual playmaker on the pitch. So consider him the exception that earned the invite. And for the aspiring playmakers watching, this chart is basically your job description. You want all three of these in your armory: the grubbers, the cross kicks, the chips and contestables in your boot, the footwork to threaten the line yourself, and the decision making to see space early and put a teammate through it. That last one is what try assists actually measure. Good decisions made a second earlier than everyone else. Last player chart, the two-way beasts. Meters per carry along the bottom, that is, what do you do when you have the ball? How hard are you to stop? And then dominant tackle percentage up the side. When you don't have the ball, how hard do you hit? Top right is the player who wins the contact battle in both directions. And tonight, to be fair, nobody lives up there. What we have instead is two completely different shapes. England's players own the defensive side. Atkinson above 10% dominance. Martin just behind. Earl with a decent rate. The defense first bruisers, but all of them carrying under 3 meters a pop. And South Africa's players own the attacking side. Colby near 7 meters a carry. De Villiers 5.5. Willemse and Creel up around 4.5. And here's an interesting weekend level observation. When France played New Zealand, France owned this exact chart. Moefana, Ooredoo, the collision winners. And France lost. Tonight, England owned the defensive dominance side of it as well, and England lost. 2 games, and the team that won the dominant collision battle went home beaten twice, while the team that decided dominant tackles simply weren't worth the energy put 45 on England. I'm not saying dominant hits don't matter, but this weekend at least, efficiency beat intimidation both nights. So let's pull the whole thing together. And as always, please tell me where I'm wrong, because you guys know me, I'm wrong more than I'm right. South Africa had complete dominance in this game, wire to wire, 80 minutes in front, never once threatened on the scoreboard for longer than a few minutes at a time. But the stats add texture the eye test missed. England had exactly one period, from about minute 27 to half time, kicked off by that Arnsur yellow, where they genuinely played and they turned it into 12 points and a 17-12 scoreboard that flattered nobody's nerves. The game's true story is that South Africa took the momentum back within 4 minutes of the restart and never returned it. And England's deeper truth is the strangest stat of the night: 4.2 points per visit. Better red zone execution than 87% of all test teams in 3 years. Better than both teams managed between New Zealand and France. And they did that on just 5 visits. Only the bottom 6th of test teams ever experienced that level of starvation. England were good enough to take their chances. They just weren't good enough to create them. The good news for English fans is that that is fixable. And it's a structural fix. If I'm an England coach, I'm not spending Monday on finishing drills. The finishing was fine. I'll be spending Monday on how we earn the right to visit the 22 more often than 5 times. And Springboks, man, what we watched, I'm now convinced that was a deliberate second mode. 1 dominant tackle out of 174. South Africa also played the same exact way in Paris last November. Same profile. Decline the hero collision, complete the tackle, save the violence for the carry, where they led the entire weekend. And for the scoreboard, where they closed with 14 unanswered points against 13 men at altitude in game 1 of the window. And for those who say that this team is aging, that's actually a team that's not getting older. That's a team getting smarter. And to keep myself honest before anyone accuses me of writing a Springbok love letter, this wasn't flawless. South Africa lost 12 turnovers in this game to England's 9. There was slop in there. They won the right moments and the high-value categories, but not every category. So there are areas for improvement for sure. Man, New Zealand versus France and South Africa versus England. 2 games and genuinely 2 different sports. New Zealand versus France, the second fastest test we've ever measured. 83 and 78% quick ball tempo used as a weapon. And South Africa versus England, the 36th slowest. 47% for both teams. Territory and efficiency was used as the weapon. And yet, the sixth most ruthless game in the dataset. And yes, conditions matter. At Christchurch, they were playing under a roof on a dry track, built for running rugby. Saturday was at Ellis Park at altitude where every sprint cost double. So I'm not crowning one style, but here's the question this weekend leaves us with. And honestly, it's the question of the whole tournament. What happens when these two styles meet? When 83% quick ball All Blacks run into a Springbok side that's happy at 47, who bends first? Can South Africa slow that game down to their tempo? Can New Zealand keep the speed up against a team that makes every collision cost double? We'll definitely get the answer before this nation's championship is done, and I genuinely can't wait. So that's the deep dive. Two things for the comments. First, for my Bokke fans, that one dominant tackle number, is this the plan for 2027? Shift to this high energy managed carry first Springbok style? Or is it a horses for courses thing for altitude that we never see at sea level? Because it's now happened twice, and I don't think it's an accident. And second, England fans, 4.2 points a visit says the attack was working. 5 visits says that it never received enough access. Which one is the real England? The fumbling England that couldn't get access, or the ruthless executors who managed to get 4.2 points per visit? I genuinely want to hear from you because you watch this team every week and I obviously don't. If you enjoyed this analysis, please tell a friend, share it with your fellow rugby tragics, hit like, subscribe, put on the bell notification, and I will see you next week.